I never thought I'd be writing this, but here we are. I'm 26, female. And this whole mess started 8 months ago when I finally ended things with my ex-boyfriend Dan, who's 28. We'd been together for almost 3 years. And looking back, I can see all the red flags I ignored because I thought his possessive behavior was just protective. The relationship wasn't physically abusive, but Dan made me feel like I couldn't breathe. He'd show up at my workplace unannounced, go through my phone when I showered, question me and every friend, and had opinions about everything from what I wore to what I ate. When I tried to discuss feeling suffocated, he'd say he just loved me so much he couldn't help wanting to be involved in every aspect of my life. The breaking point came when he secretly installed a tracking app on my phone. My best friend Sarah discovered it when she noticed my phone acting weird. When I confronted Dan, he didn't deny it. He said he did it for my safety, and that if I had nothing to hide, it shouldn't bother me. That's when I realized this wasn't love. It was control. Breaking up with Dan was like escaping quicksand. Every time I tried to end things, he'd show up with elaborate apologies, expensive gifts, or threats to hurt himself. He'd camp outside my apartment for hours, leave dozens of crying voicemails, and somehow always knew where I'd be. I started staying at Sarah's because I was scared to be alone. My parents knew we'd broken up, but didn't know the full extent of what was happening. They'd always liked Dan because he was charming around them, bringing my mom flowers, helping my dad with yard work. When I explained why I'd ended things, they kept saying, relationships take work, and maybe we just needed time apart. Things escalated when Dan started showing up at my job so frequently that my boss asked what was going on. I work as a graphic designer at a small marketing firm, and Dan would come in claiming he needed to drop something off, or that we had forgotten lunch plans. My co-workers got uncomfortable and I was mortified. I told my boss the truth and she was understanding, but said if it continued, she'd call the police. That's exactly what happened 2 weeks later. Dan showed up at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, demanding to speak with me. When the receptionist said I was in a meeting, he pushed past her and barged into the conference room where I was presenting to a client. He started yelling about how I was ignoring his calls, how I was being unreasonable, how we needed to talk right now. My boss called 911 while co-workers tried to get Dan to leave. Police arrived within 10 minutes and arrested Dan for trespassing and disturbing the peace. I was shaking and crying from fear and embarrassment. The officers took detailed statements, and when I told them about the tracking app, constant showing up and harassment, they encouraged me to file a formal stalking complaint. I spent the next day at the police station with a victim advocate documenting everything Dan had done. We had phone records showing dozens of daily calls and texts, photos of gifts left on my doorstep, screenshots of fake social media accounts he'd created to monitor me, and witness statements. The detective said Dan's behavior definitely constituted stalking and they'd press charges. They strongly recommended a restraining order, which I filed that afternoon. The temporary order was granted immediately, requiring Dan to stay 500 feet away from me, my home, workplace, and other regular locations. Here's where my parents enter this nightmare. Dan got out on bail and called my parents crying, telling them how sorry he was, how he just needed a place to stay while he figured things out. Without consulting me, they invited him to stay in their guest bedroom. I found out when my mom called 3 days later asking why I wasn't returning Dan's calls and suggesting I should hear him out since he was clearly devastated and just wanted to make things right. When she mentioned he was staying with them, I completely lost it. My dad got on the phone lecturing me about forgiveness and second chances. He said Dan had explained everything, that it was all a misunderstanding, and his behavior was just love taken too far. My mom said Dan seemed genuinely remorseful and maybe I was overreacting to typical relationship problems. I tried explaining the severity of Dan's behavior, but they kept interrupting and defending him. My dad said I was being dramatic and that men were expected to fight for women they loved. My mom said Dan showed them sweet messages and thoughtful gifts, and she couldn't understand why I was being so cold and unforgiving. The conversation ended with me hanging up after my dad accused me of being vindictive and ruining a good man's life over typical relationship drama. I called my lawyer immediately. My lawyer explained that since my parents' house wasn't specifically listed in the restraining order, Dan technically wasn't violating it by staying there. However, we could request modification to include their address, especially since they were enabling continued harassment. I decided to proceed and sent my parents a certified letter giving them 48 hours to remove Dan before I sought legal action. My mom called hysterically within an hour, saying I was being cruel and vindictive, tearing the family apart over a boy. My dad texted that they weren't kicking Dan out based on my ultimatum, and if I wanted to involve lawyers, that was my choice. But they wouldn't abandon someone who needed help just because I was being stubborn. The hearing went exactly as my lawyer predicted. The judge reviewed evidence of Dan's stalking, that my parents were knowingly housing him despite the existing order, and ongoing attempts to pressure me into contact through them. She granted the modification without hesitation. Police served Dan that afternoon. My parents were also served, meaning they could face legal consequences if they allowed Dan to return. They called that evening scared instead of angry. My mom was crying, saying she didn't realize things were this serious. My dad was quieter, but admitted they might have made a mistake. But even then, they didn't fully get it. They still seemed to think this was relationship drama that could be resolved with communication and compromise. I told them Dan's behavior was criminal harassment, that I was afraid for my safety, and by housing him, they told me his feelings mattered more than my safety. For 3 weeks, I didn't hear from them. Dan found somewhere else to stay, and I finally felt like maybe I could move on. Then my mom started calling again, initially just checking in, which felt like progress. She seemed to be trying to understand my perspective and even apologize for not taking Dan's behavior seriously. But last week, the real reason became clear. She called Sunday evening in tears, explaining their homeowners association had sent them a legal notice about police activity at their address. Having police serve restraining order papers and remove someone had triggered an HOA investigation into whether they were running an unlawful boarding house or violating neighborhood covenants. The HOA was demanding documentation about Dan's stay, threatening fines for violating occupancy rules, and warning that continued legal issues could result in liens or forced sale of their home. They'd hired a lawyer costing thousands they didn't have. My mom asked me to contact my lawyer about lifting the ban on their address so they could show the HOA that legal issues were resolved. I was stunned. I explained that the restraining order wasn't something I could turn on and off, and it existed to protect me from someone arrested for stalking me. My mom started crying, saying they were going to lose their house, that HOA fees and legal costs were more than they could afford. She said Dan had been staying across town and hadn't bothered me since the order was modified, proving he'd learned his lesson. When I explained that 3 weeks of following a court order didn't undo months of stalking, she said I was being unreasonable and holding a grudge. My dad was more direct, saying if I really cared about my family, I'd work with them to resolve this. He pointed out they were facing serious financial consequences for trying to help someone in trouble, and as their daughter, I should compromise to protect them from losing their home. I told them I needed time to think, but honestly, there's nothing to think about. The restraining order exists because Dan stalked me to the point where I was afraid to go to work or be alone. My parents are dealing with HOA problems because they chose to house my stalker after his arrest, knowing there was a restraining order. My lawyer was clear that modifying the restraining order would be bad from legal and safety perspectives. Stalking cases often involved periods where perpetrators appear to have moved on, only to escalate later. Dan's manipulation of my parents demonstrated exactly the dangerous behavior that made him threatening. She also explained that even if I wanted to modify the order, it wouldn't be simple. I'd have to file a petition, attend another hearing, and potentially face Dan and his lawyer. The judge would want to understand why I felt safe enough to remove protections put in place for good reasons. More importantly, removing my parents' address wouldn't necessarily solve their HOA problem anyway, since the documented criminal activity had already occurred. Am I being unreasonable? Should I risk my safety to help my parents deal with the consequences of their own choices? Or is it fair to maintain boundaries and protections for good reasons, even if my parents face results of siding with my stalker over me? Update 1. Thank you to everyone who commented with support and advice. Your responses help me feel less crazy and confirmed I'm not overreacting. I contacted my parents' neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, to understand what they're really dealing with. She told me police activity had definitely been noticed, especially since it happened twice in weeks. Some residents complained to the HOA about criminal activity and suspicious persons, specifically mentioning my parents' address. The HOA launched an investigation not just into covenant violations, but whether my parents had been subletting without permission, violating both HOA agreement and mortgage terms. What I hadn't realized was Dan had been presenting himself to neighbors as my parents' new tenant, not just a temporary guest. He told several people he was renting the guest room long term. Neighbors saw him coming and going at all hours, bringing friends over, acting like he lived there permanently. When police served the modified restraining order and removed him, it looked like law enforcement was evicting a problematic tenant for criminal behavior. Mrs. Patterson also mentioned Dan had made neighbors uncomfortable before the police incident. He'd approached several women asking questions about me, whether they'd seen me visiting lately, whether I was dating anyone new. People found his questions inappropriate and intrusive, especially since he introduced himself as my ex-boyfriend, trying to work things out. This made me realize Dan had been using my parents' house as a base to continue stalking and gathering information about me. It also explained why the HOA was taking such a hard line. From their perspective, my parents had been harboring someone engaging in criminal harassment and making residents feel unsafe. My lawyer said this information strengthened the case for keeping my parents' address in the restraining order. Dan's behavior towards neighbors demonstrated he was still fixated on me and actively seeking information about my activities. Meanwhile, my parents had been calling multiple times daily, begging me to reconsider. My mom left a voicemail saying they'd racked up over $5,000 in legal fees, fighting HOA demands, and their lawyer said their best chance was proving there was no ongoing criminal activity at their property. My dad alternated between guilt trips and anger. He said he was disappointed in who I'd become, and that the daughter he raised would never let her parents lose their home over something so petty. In another call, he said if I really believed Dan was dangerous, I should have warned them before letting him stay, making their problems partly my fault. This accusation really got to me because I did try to warn them multiple times. I told them Dan had been arrested for stalking and there was a restraining order. I sent a certified letter giving them 48 hours to remove him before seeking legal action, but they chose to believe Dan's version and dismissed my concerns. I went through phone records, text messages, documenting exactly what I told my parents and when. I found dozens of messages where I'd explained Dan's behavior, asked for support, and warned about consequences of housing him. I found voicemails where I'd explicitly said Dan's behavior was criminal harassment that scared me enough to involve police. Looking at this timeline made me realize my parents had made a deliberate choice to ignore warnings and side with Dan despite having clear information. They hadn't been misled. They decided Dan's tears and apologies were more convincing than their daughter's fear and documented evidence. Throughout this ordeal, my parents have never once asked how I'm doing, whether I feel safe. Every conversation has been about Dan's feelings, their HOA problems, or their disappointment in my choices. They've never acknowledged that I was victimized by someone they chose to protect. Yesterday, I got a call from Dan's friend, Marcus, saying Dan asked him to reach out to apologize and asked me to reconsider modifying the restraining order so my parents wouldn't lose their house. Marcus said Dan understood his behavior was inappropriate, was getting therapy, and just wanted to make things right. I told Marcus that Dan was prohibited from contacting me directly or through third parties under the restraining order terms, and his call could be considered a violation. Marcus seemed surprised and apologized, saying he wouldn't contact me again. I reported the contact to my lawyer, who said it was definitely a gray area violation since Marcus explicitly said Dan asked him to call. The incident made me realize Dan is still trying to manipulate the situation and get around the restraining order. I've made my decision. I'm not modifying the restraining order, regardless of what happens with my parents' HOA situation. I sent them a final email explaining that I love them and I'm sorry they're dealing with stress, but I can't compromise my safety to solve problems resulting from their choice to house someone who stalked me. I told them I'm willing to work on rebuilding our relationship once this is resolved, but only if they can acknowledge their serious mistakes and show genuine understanding of why their actions were hurtful and dangerous. Until then, I need space to focus on healing and moving forward. Update 2. Things have taken a completely unexpected turn. On Tuesday morning, Detective Morrison called asking me to come to the station because of developments in Dan's case. I panicked, thinking Dan had violated the restraining order majorly. At the station, Detective Morrison explained they'd received a call from Dan's current roommate, David, who had become uncomfortable with Dan's behavior and contacted police after finding disturbing items in Dan's belongings. David had been letting Dan stay in his spare room as a favor, but started noticing weird things immediately. Dan would spend hours on his laptop looking at social media profiles and photos, printing pages and organizing them in folders. He'd caught Dan taking calls where he was clearly discussing me, talking about my routine, asking for updates about where I'd been seen. The breaking point came when David accidentally knocked over a shopping bag while helping Dan move boxes. Inside were dozens of printed photos of me, including recent ones taken without my knowledge. Handwritten notes were tracking my schedule, maps with my apartment and workplace marked, and what looked like detailed plans for approaching me in various locations. When David confronted Dan, he became agitated and defensive, claiming he was trying to understand why I was being unreasonable about the restraining order and documenting his side for his lawyer. When David said the materials looked like stalking evidence, Dan became angry and accused David of betraying him like everyone else. That night, David heard Dan planning to contact me despite the restraining order. Dan was talking about explaining his side directly, how everyone was keeping us apart unnecessarily, and how he'd find a way to make me understand we belonged together. David said Dan sounded increasingly desperate and disconnected from reality. David waited until Dan left the next morning and then called the police. When Detective Morrison searched Dan's room, they found even more disturbing evidence. Along with photos and tracking materials, they discovered a detailed diary where Dan recorded his thoughts about me, our relationship, and his plans for getting me back. Detective Morrison showed me excerpts, and reading them made me sick. Dan had written elaborate fantasies about confronting and forcing me to listen to his explanations. He documented every piece of information about my current life, including work schedule, friends' activities, places I'd been seen. Most disturbing were his theories about why I'd gotten the restraining order. Dan was convinced I'd been manipulated by friends and my lawyer into believing he was dangerous, and that if he could get me alone to talk without outside interference, I'd realize his behavior was motivated by love, and we could work things out. There were detailed plans for approaching me without technically violating the restraining order. He'd researched exact distance requirements and mapped routes allowing him to be in the same areas while staying outside prohibited range. He'd also written about using other people to pass messages or gather information. The diary entries became increasingly erratic and obsessive. Dan had convinced himself the restraining order was temporary, and that once I saw how much he'd changed and how sorry he was, I'd give our relationship another chance. Based on this evidence, they filed additional stalking charges and arrested Dan again that morning. The diary and photo collection demonstrated Dan had been continuing to stalk me even after the restraining order, a serious violation that could result in jail time. Detective Morrison said Dan's behavior had likely escalated because he'd been cut off from his support system when my parents were forced to stop housing him. Stalkers often became more dangerous when they feel increasingly isolated and desperate. Given the new evidence, the prosecutor would seek enhanced charges and possibly jail time rather than probation. She recommended I upgrade security measures since Dan's diary indicated he'd been conducting surveillance and might attempt direct approach. I left feeling completely overwhelmed and more scared than since this started. Learning Dan had been stalking me from a distance while I thought the restraining order was protecting me was terrifying. I'd let my guard down when the threat had just become more hidden and sophisticated. The strangest part is I haven't heard from my parents since Dan's arrest became public. Mrs. Patterson told me it was covered in the local crime blotter, so they know, but they haven't called to check on me or acknowledge that evidence proves Dan was still dangerous even after they thought he'd learned his lesson. For the first time in almost a year, I'm starting to feel I might actually move forward without constantly looking over my shoulder. Detective Morrison said, with the new charges and evidence, Dan would likely be held without bail until trial, which could take several months. Update 3. The final twist in this whole nightmare came completely out of left field. Just when I thought things couldn't get any more surreal, I got a call yesterday morning that turned everything upside down again. It was Mrs. Patterson, my parents' next-door neighbor. She asked me if I'd heard about what happened at my parents' house the night before. I hadn't spoken to them in a couple of days, so I said no, and immediately her tone got serious. She told me that police cars and even fire trucks had been outside my parents' home until almost midnight because of some kind of incident involving property damage. My chest tightened the second she said it because even before she gave me the details, I just knew it had to be Dan. I hung up and called my parents right away. My mom answered, and I could hear how drained she sounded before she even got the words out. Her voice was shaky and tired, like she hadn't slept at all, but underneath that I could hear something else too. Relief. And then she told me everything. Apparently Dan had managed to get bail again. To this day, I don't know how. Detective Morrison had told me he was supposed to be held without bond, so hearing he'd been released again felt like someone had pulled the rug out from under me. Somehow, through some loophole or judge's decision, he was back on the streets, and by 10 p.m., he was at my parents' front door, drunk and completely unhinged. My mom said it started with him pounding on the door with his fists, screaming at the top of his lungs. He was shouting about betrayal, about how I had ruined his life, about how my parents had abandoned him. His words were slurred, but his rage was crystal clear. She said it was the kind of screaming that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up because it didn't sound like a man in control of himself. It sounded like pure, dangerous fury. When my parents refused to let him in and shouted through the door that they were calling the police, he snapped. Instead of leaving, he stormed around to the backyard and started destroying things. He threw the patio chairs at the windows, shattering several panes. He smashed garden decorations, ripped up solar lights, and knocked over planters. He was completely out of control. My dad, being stubborn, tried to go outside to confront him and get him to leave, but Dan shoved him to the ground without hesitation. My dad hit the concrete hard enough to scrape up his hands and knees. That was the breaking point for my mom. She ran to call 911 immediately while dragging my dad back inside. By then, Dan had moved to the front of the house and was throwing rocks at the living room window, cracking it so badly that the glass looked like a spider web. The police arrived within minutes, and by that time, half the neighborhood was awake and watching from their porches and windows. Dan was arrested on the spot, and this time they booked him for criminal trespassing, vandalism, and assault. My mom said it wasn't even a struggle. He was too far gone in his drunken rage to put up much resistance. Here's the strange part. As horrifying as it was, my mom told me that in a way it was also a turning point. She said that watching Dan completely unravel right there in front of them, hurting my dad, screaming threats, destroying their property, was the moment everything finally clicked. For months they'd convinced themselves that his persistence was misguided love, that his charm and words about wanting to make things right meant he wasn't really a threat. But in those moments when he was throwing rocks at their house and shoving my dad to the ground, there was no more room for excuses. They saw him the way I'd seen him, all along, unstable, dangerous, completely unhinged. My mom broke down crying on the phone as she told me this. She apologized for not believing me sooner, for making me feel like I had to choose between protecting myself and keeping a relationship with them. She admitted that they'd been so focused on how Dan presented himself to them, polite, charismatic, and desperate to prove his love, that they'd ignored every red flag and brushed off my concerns as overreactions. What's ironic is that this terrifying incident ended up solving their HOA problem too. For weeks, the Homeowners Association had been breathing down their necks, threatening fines, investigations, because of Dan's previous stay in their home. They'd been accused of harboring him illegally, allowing criminal activity in the neighborhood. But after this incident, with police reports and witness statements from neighbors, it was clear my parents weren't enablers. They were victims. Their lawyer presented the report to the HOA, and the board immediately backed off. In fact, they held an emergency session and decided to waive the fines and drop the investigation entirely. Some members even apologized for the stress they'd piled on. Neighbors who had previously gossiped about my parents were now sympathetic, realizing that Dan hadn't been some misunderstood house guest. They had been manipulated and threatened just like me. My dad also apologized to me, though it was clearly hard for him. He admitted that he'd always taken pride in being able to read people, to trust his gut when it came to character. Realizing that Dan had fooled him so completely, had looked him in the eye and convinced him of lies, shook his confidence in a way I'd never seen before. He told me outright that he should have listened to me from the beginning and that his decision to let Dan stay under their roof had put everyone at risk. Both my parents now understand why the restraining order had to stay in place and why I couldn't back down no matter how much they had pressured me in the past. My mom admitted she felt ashamed for ever asking me to compromise my safety for their peace of mind. Later that same day, Detective Morrison called to give me an official update. Dan's bail had been revoked immediately after the incident, and this time there was no chance of him getting out. He was being held without bond pending trial. The prosecutor was treating this as evidence that Dan posed as an ongoing serious threat. His blatant violation of the restraining order combined with the escalation to violence meant additional felony charges were likely. Detective Morrison said his actions that night might add years to his sentence, which finally gave me a real sense of hope that this would end with him facing serious consequences. This morning, my mom called again. She asked if I'd consider visiting soon, just to talk about rebuilding our relationship. She told me she and my dad had been reading survivor accounts and resources online about stalking and domestic violence. They were beginning to understand how often families fail victims at first because they can't accept that someone they know or think they know could be capable of abuse. She said they didn't want to make that mistake ever again. I told her I'd think about it, and I meant it. I do want to repair things with them, but the hurt is still fresh. It'll take time for me to rebuild trust and believe they'll stand by me unconditionally if something like this ever happens again. For now, though, I'm focusing on moving forward. Dan is in jail where he belongs. My parents have finally opened their eyes. And for the first time in almost a year, I feel like I can breathe. The restraining order will stay in place and the trial will move forward, but knowing he's locked up gives me peace I haven't felt in so long. It's been such a long road since the day I discovered that tracking app on my phone, but I've learned so much about myself in the process, about trusting my instincts, standing up for my safety and refusing to compromise just to make other people comfortable. And to everyone here who has listened to me vent, offered advice, and reminded me that my safety mattered when even my own family doubted me, thank you. You've been a lifeline through one of the darkest times of my life. This nightmare might finally be ending, and I don't think I could have gotten here without the support I found in this community. Stay tuned for more stories from Our Girl Relationships.